Okay, so we are here to talk about, on this panel. We have it's two of us here present, but we have two more speakers joining us remotely, which I was hoping that we would see, but we don't see them. We don't see the other speaker? Not until they come in. Okay. So I'll introduce you. There you go. I'll introduce you by name, all of them now, but then I'll read a bit of their biography bit by bit before they speak. We have Professor Mark Sutton, we have Irini Maltsoglou, we have Hamish Jolie, and we have Henry Duval here with us. First of all, I'll talk myself a little bit. I'll introduce myself. My name is Amaya Arias Garcia. I work for Nortegas, which is one of the gas distributors in the north of Spain. I worked there since September last year, and prior to that, I spent 27 years in the UK building AD plants and operating and working with many of you in this audience. I also work very closely with WBA. I pride myself for representing them in Spain. I do what I can to help. And I work with some of you in the PITC working groups. The main one, the one I run, is education and outreach. So if you are a WBA member and want to join us in the education group, we do a lot of fun work at creating educational material to spread the word and tell everybody about AD in the world. This is the panel, which is quite handy to have all the names there, and you can see Joseph has been replaced because unfortunately he wasn't feeling well, but I'll introduce them later. When I talk in this event, I always think, what can I say that the audience is interested in? I find myself always speaking to people that has listened to me before. So we seem to have a problem in that people don't know about AD. And that's one of the main barriers. When we set to develop an AD plant, our barriers are either economics or policy. If you read the latest report from WBA, policy was one of the main ones. And I'm talking worldwide. I'm not talking in the UK, where we are lucky that our politicians engage with us and we have the opportunity to talk to them and present the facts. I'm talking about worldwide, where we need to influence our politicians. The fact is that there is 105 billion tons of organic waste globally each year. If I divide that between the average AD plant, are we going to really build 2 million AD plants? That's what we are set to do. So for me to talk to you about the figures that you can read in all the reports, to talk to you about the things that you can read on the net that we read constantly, is a waste of time. What we need to do is to figure out how we break the barriers, how we go out and talk to our politicians, and we tell them the wonders of AD. So if you get anything out of today, think about how can you spread the word. Perhaps you can join us at WBA Education Working Group. Perhaps you can do it your own way. But to me, that's the most important part. I put this as a good feel story. If the Danish can do it, we can do it. That's my lemma. How can we do it? I talk to Danish people all the time at all levels to learn from them. At the end, it's all about educating our leaders so they understand the benefits and they actually do their best for AD to become a technology that provides solutions to common day, I wouldn't want to say problems, but we have resources that we can utilize. A good friend of mine pointed this out on LinkedIn these last 2 weeks. And as I didn't want to repeat myself, I picked, you've got the book source at the bottom, which I find it quite refreshing. If you look at the cartoons that I picked from this publication, the first one is that we have to learn to think on multiple levels, especially the leaders. If you are a leader in this room, think on multiple levels. We need to tell our politicians and our leaders that AD is not just energy, and that's me working for Nortegas. AD is biofertilizers, resource recovery, soil, community, understanding. That's what AD is, understanding of the nature of life. It's not about moving trash around. If you think in terms of systems, you realize that you can't ship trash to other side of the planet and claim you have nailed recycling. We need to talk locally. We need to work together, different departments. We need to regenerate the planet. The circular economy is not this chicken that gives you golden eggs. The circular economy is about regeneration. Organizations need to work together. It's not about competitive advantage to work in AD. It's not about having a bonus because I've developed 3 AD plants. It's not about keeping the information for yourself to give you advantage. It's about all of us working together. And yeah, it's a natural resource, what we have. All the organic material is a natural resource, and we are eating our natural resources. So if you keep anything out of my talk, collaborate, spread the word, and let's work together. And thank you. That's my email address if you want to. I'm now going to introduce the next speaker, which is Professor Mark Sutton, which I see there. Hi, Mark. You probably cannot see me. Mark is an environmental physicist based at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in Edinburgh, beautiful city. He's an expert on atmospheric ammonia, and he leads international research activities on nitrogen and the science policy interface. I'm sure he can tell you a little bit more about himself because he's doing a lot of interesting work. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amaya, and good afternoon to everybody. Well, of course, most of the time you're talking about biogas as gas, methane, and contamination with carbon dioxide and managing that. But I'm really here to tell you about the nitrogen part of the biogas story. And my message is that nitrogen has to be an essential part of everything thinking about biogas because it's a really critical component of it. Think about anaerobic digestion when you're taking organic matter and you're getting off the methane, getting off carbon dioxide, but of course you're also getting nitrogen gases. Perhaps the most important nitrogen gas in this system is ammonia. But of course, decomposing organic matter has risks for nitrous oxide as another greenhouse gas as well. Now, when talking about nitrogen, we've summarized it down to say 5 big issues for caring about nitrogen. And we summarized it as an acronym: wages, water, air, greenhouse, ecosystems, soil. So water pollution, if the nitrogen is not in the right place, it's going down into water courses. Air pollution, the ammonia is a air pollutant contributing to shortening human lives through particulate matter in the atmosphere, contributing to ecosystem damage. Greenhouse gas, of course, you've got the N2O part of that leaking. Threats to ecosystems can also include toxic effects of ammonia and nitrogen dioxide. And of course, then you finally got the soils and managing soils sustainably. So there's multiple reasons for thinking about nitrogen. And in anaerobic digestion, it's clear that we need to think about the nitrogen too. So when it comes to anaerobic digestion, I am not a specific expert in anaerobic digestion. My area is nitrogen. But I hear often people being critical of things. And I think nitrogen gives us an opportunity to reduce those criticisms and harvest the benefits. So let's just take an obvious one: people complaining about putting inappropriate feedstocks in. growing a crop with a huge amount of nitrogen fertilizers, creating nitrous oxide emissions on the way, and then finally producing methane from decomposing it at the end. Of course, that is a bit counterintuitive. The answer to it, of course, is using sensible feedstocks, and if growing bioenergy crops which have a very low nitrogen requirement. But let's come to the other side of it, which is another downside is with the liquor afterwards. It's high pH, very volatile for ammonia. So people talking about anaerobic digestion increasing ammonia emissions. Well, again, there's a problem. There's a very easy answer, which is called the full system to harvest also those ammonia emissions. So every kilogram of nitrogen lost to the atmosphere is the loss of a resource, which traditionally is something like €1 or £1 per kilogram of nitrogen. And currently with the fertilizer crisis, we're talking something like €3 per kilogram of nitrogen. So this really is valuable stuff to recover. And of course, when recovering it, it means we're doing something positive for air pollution and at the same time. So this is really an opportunity for the circular economy. Of course, there's a whole range of methods out there. Perhaps the starting one is ammonia stripping, essentially warming up to really deliberately get the ammonia off, capture the ammonia, put it together with an acid like sulfuric acid, make ammonium sulfate fertilizer. Of course, you may not want to go so far as that. You might say, well, I want to use my product locally. But again, the answer there, acidification can stop those ammonia emissions and make sure the nitrogen lands in the soil rather than in the atmosphere. Another method is using struvite, where you precipitate out the ammonia and then recover the struvite, or even desorb the ammonia from the struvite afterwards to make ammonium sulfate again. There's a whole range of techniques, and that's really for you guys to mobilize on the different techniques and making them economical. But let's look at it in the sense of markets, because we've got these hugely fluctuating fertilizer prices. We see the problem with the Ukraine at the moment. Imagine a world where fertilizer manufacturers are saying this is a good thing for them, is a good thing for their branding, it's a good thing for price stability. Imagine them committing to say that 20% of our fertilizer is going to contain recycled nitrogen sources. In that world, then the world of anaerobic digestion becomes critical to delivery of that. And that really does mean billions of anaerobic digestion plants, but plants which are recovering that nitrogen, not just letting it leak out into the atmosphere. I want to make a brief comparison with composting, because I know there are many advocates out there for composting, but from a nitrogen perspective, the problem is that that can really risk wasting the nitrogen as ammonia emissions, but also encouraging denitrification to N2. Some people will say denitrification is a good thing because it removes pollution. I will say it's a dumb thing because it's deliberately wasting resources. Much better to keep it as ammonia, use it, turn it back to fertilizer. Now let's just put this waste story and wasting nitrogen into global context. So we're working with the United Nations Environment Programme. We're looking at these water, air, greenhouse, ecosystem, soils, all the different nitrogen forms together. We've been framing a narrative towards halving total nitrogen waste on the planet, which per year would save you about 100 million tons of nitrogen, and on traditional prices about $100 billion of nitrogen per year, resource saving. At current prices, that would be $300 billion. So halve nitrogen waste has been an ambition that's been included into firstly the Colombo Declaration, an agreement by 14 countries to have the ambition to halve nitrogen waste by 2030. It's also been recognized in a new resolution at the United Nations Environment Assembly this February. Actually, we didn't get the halve nitrogen waste. Of course, you can imagine that some countries didn't want to have that ambition. What was agreed was to significantly accelerate action to significantly reduce nitrogen waste by 2030. And of course, in the same time, by failing to agree that meant that the NGOs were busily complaining that it was a failure of the meeting to deliver. awareness was increased. So I think this is about gaming as well, about raising awareness. Of course, at the same time, we really need to improve our guidance, and we've recently developed a guidance document on sustainable nitrogen management with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. So that's giving out the details on how to take these methods. So there we are. This is an issue about developing a new language and new thinking. Biogas is not just about carbon and methane, it's about nitrogen too. And I hope we can see that as part of a package that's going to make it more economical for your industry and good for the environment at the same time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to remind everybody that you can ask questions at the end, and also on the platform, those that have joined us remotely via the platform. So I'm keeping an eye on the questions and I can read them out loud later. Our next speaker is Irini Maltsoglou. Is she joining us? I could start introducing her. She's Natural Resource Officer, Deputy Energy Team Leader for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Irini leads the work on renewable energy assessments in the context of agri-food systems, focusing especially on energy needs, renewable energy for agri-food chains, and bioenergy assessments through the bioenergy and food security approach. Quite a job.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, good. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the floor and the opportunity to participate in the panel today. I will going through a bit of a different perspective. So we're the Food and Agriculture Organization, and we work on bioenergy, generally very much from a developing country perspective, and also from the perspective of wanting to integrate bioenergy with the agriculture setting and the energy setting in the country. So to start off with, as we know, bioenergy is very closely linked to the agriculture sector and therefore to food security. So what we try and do, I'm moving ahead with my with the elements on my slide, but I don't see that on the screen in the room. Do you see that coming up?
No. Ahora. Now.
Okay, now it's coming. Yeah. Okay, so considering the setting of the country, what we try and understand is which options can be viable. So we look at that from a number of perspectives. And so as Amaya was saying, what is extremely important is bringing all the different disciplines at policy level. It will be very important to work across the different ministries. So Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Agriculture, of Forestry, of Livestock. These are some of the key stakeholders. The way we look at it is, is through the bioenergy and food security approach of FAO, and that can also be found on our website. Okay, so I'll start from bioenergy generally, but obviously this then homes in on biogas. So in terms of the options and the opportunities that we look at the broad range of bioenergy, so going from all feedstock in terms of crop, of livestock and of forestry, and then going into a number of bioenergy technologies. So what we start with is looking at the context and the feedstock options. I'm sorry, but again, on the screen in the room, it's different from my screen. Okay. The animation isn't working. Yeah, okay. So we first start with the context, so looking at the feedstock options. Then secondly, Secondly, it's the assessment, and then bioenergy technology. So looking at opportunities for off-grid electricity production, for cooking biofuels, and in the transport sector. In discussion with the countries, it will be then the countries to define what their specific needs are and what their specific interest is. What we use to actually assess this is the BEFS assessment. So we start with the feedstock, and at feedstock level, we look at feedstock availability. So really understanding the amounts of feedstock that are available and can be used in the country, and a whole series of feedstock characteristics, including, for example, heating values, collection costs, and so on. And then we look at the analysis of this, covering techno-economic elements of analysis, so looking and homing into the profitability and how the bioenergy option could fare against either other energy uses in the country. Now, what I wanted to show here is what the final output of the analysis will look like. And as you can see, it is generally either in tabular format or in a map format. And so what the map will tell us is where the feasible options for bioenergy production can be in the country, having inbuilt all of these elements. So just to give you a bit of a sense of some recent work, for example, in India, we've been looking at rice straw burning. Huge amounts of rice straw actually burnt in the field. So this is an element of lost resource that is currently generating greenhouse gas emissions. And we looked at whether this could be used for bioenergy production, a number of bioenergy types, including compressed biogas. And again, working with the various ministries and entities involved in the country in this field. So what you can see here is photos of what the CBG application would look like, and a map of the area that we worked on, which is the state of Punjab, showing you the amounts of biogas that could be produced and the locations, having inbuilt all the elements that I went through before. Secondly, the case of Zambia, a very different agriculture and energy context, huge reliance on agriculture and important issues of access to energy in the country. In that case, we looked at biogas in the context of possible cooking fuels. What you can see on the bottom of the graph there with the light blue area is a region where that has medium potential and where biogas could play a significant role. So the map, having again inbuilt all these constraints in, shows us where biogas could play a role and also where one could start from in terms of building biogas plants. Now, a final case is the case of Seychelles. So again, a very different setting, very small country, very pristine and delicate environment. The case of Seychelles is interesting because they have a huge issue of waste disposal. So they have a waste disposal problem. Obviously, the area that they have to dispose waste is very constrained. So the interest was looking at what opportunities might exist to actually use that waste to produce biogas. And the results show that although the role would be small, actually these residues could be used for biogas production in the country. Now, the other side of the coin that I did want to flag is instead a case where objectives for biogas development were set up, but some constraints were not considered. So this is the case of Rwanda. In 2008, the country decided to launch the biogas program in the country. The year of start was 2008 with the target of 15,000 biogas plants to be built by 2011. We then saw that this was reduced to 5,000 in 2009, further to 3,000 in 2010, and down to 1,800 being built in 2012 from the initial target of 15,000. So which were some elements that were not or either were not correctly factored into the program? First of all, manure and water. The calculations in terms of manure considered much higher rates than the actual livestock allow in the country, and access to water was assumed as granted, while a lot of households in Rwanda have to walk significant distances to actually collect the water. So collecting a suitable amount to pair with the manure is definitely an issue. And then issues around correct maintenance, teaching, maintenance, and having systems in place to allow to repair the systems, resulting then in very low biogas rates that would not then be enough to cover the cooking needs of families. So our advice, having reviewed the program, would be that really the system needs to marry the country context, the country needs, and the country settings. So in conclusion, now, I wanted to show with the various countries that bioenergy in general and also biogas is very country and case specific. So we need to look at the country needs, and we also need to look, especially in terms of feedstock and in terms of all the economic variables, what is feasible at the country level. In terms of feedstock options, we need to understand the agriculture setting, what can fit into that. We definitely always advocate for using the residues that exist and stimulating farmers' income through that. The logistic dimension is very rarely considered, and this ranges from feedstock accessibility, water access, biomass supply chain, essential to get the system going, very often overlooked. The cost isn't factored in, and therefore the system cannot take off. And finally, in terms of bioenergy technologies, this is needed to enable the potential. So we really need to start homing in on that. And I would say that to conclude that it's important that bioenergy gets considered within a broader energy mix. It has a role to play, but we need to enable the system so that it can play its role. And again, for the various reports and work I presented, please feel free to go to fao.org/energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to have to be bad. We have half an hour and 2 more speakers, so I'll ask the speakers to stick to their time. I know it's unfair. Our next speaker is Hamish Joly, Executive Chair of the DeLorean Corporation. Hamish holds a Bachelor of Business Law and Accounting. Henry first? Okay, no problem. Are you ready, Henry? Good. Okay, so I'll introduce Hamish later. He hasn't joined us yet? Okay. Then our next speaker is Henry. I wanted to keep Henry for the end because he builds 80 plants and I think it's a good fill factor. But Henry farms over 1,000 acres of arable land in Hampshire at Aspley Farms. In 2011, he built a flagship 80 facility which delivers 4% of the green gas in the UK, upgraded to biomethane through a DMT membrane. The facility produces over 13 megawatt of gas an hour, of course 365 days a year, which is enough to supply for 9,000 homes. It is a crop fuel utilizing the break crops that are necessary, part of the rotation system required in wheat growing. That's quite an important point, isn't it? Maize, rye, oats, and triticale and grass. And I'm sure he'll tell you a lot more about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll go and prop myself over here. some of which I'm going to say repeats what has just been said, but there we go. So just to quickly summarize our journey in AD without boring those I saw at the farmers' breakfast. We secured planning in 2010, broke ground in November 2011 with first 500 kilowatt of electricity generation in October 2012. In 2013, the RHI for biomethane was announced, and we realized we had a medium pressure pipeline just 1 kilometer away from the plant. With a huge amount of support from Scotia Gas Network, and Alan Midwinter might be here with us, but he is certainly around on in the conference today. And our bankers, we managed to get our first puff of gas into the grid by November 2014, although it was not really until the end of 2015 that we started to regularly hit full capacity, some 12 times our initial plant capacity. In December 2016, we completed our CO2 capture and liquefaction plant, and since then we have gradually improved our efficiency by over 10% and focused on the effective use, marketing of all our byproducts. We currently work with 40 local farmers who supply break crops from their rotation, as there is low demand for ensiled animal feed in central southern England. We are a crop-only plant, firstly due to the lack of manures and wastes arising from around us, but also by our decision to produce food-grade CO2 and Soil Association certified digestate for organic farms. We agree with using food waste where available in AD, but believe it should be fully pasteurized at source near cities, such as being processed alongside an incinerator plant with spare heat, with all the plastics removed and homogenized for transport as a product with an end-of-waste certificate. So what does this mean to farming? In 2018, we took back the management of all the feedstock supply from around 40 local farmers. By working with our farming supply chain, we have been able to improve crop rotation, offering alternative break crops to the usual rapeseed, traditionally grown in this part of the world. We now harvest different fields within each holding each year and ensile the crops in ag bags on each farm. This allows us to harvest with around 3 tractors per forager and then collect the crop just in time later in the year. We do efficiently with a material handler and a bulk HGV trailers. Based on our trailer weights and farm weighbridge, we have reduced clamp losses to less than 2.3%. Not only are the farmers happy to grow these low-input break crops, but those closest to us use our digestate in place of traditional manures, which are hard to find. We have recently undertaken a sustainability audit on our own farm, and as well as achieving 97% fossil fuel saving on our biomethane, we have achieved around 105 kilograms per CO2 per hectare on our own farm, around a quarter of the national average. In terms of methane emissions, our CO2 plant recovery covers any methane slippage which is fed back into the biogas plant. We have also bought a FLIR camera and survey our plant regularly, undertaking any maintenance promptly. We have covered all our lagoons and are currently building additional storage so that all our liquid digestate can all be applied at the optimum time of the year. Working as we do on grade 3 Andover series land with very thin layer of topsoil, we've always struggled to add enough organic material to our soils. As the years have passed, we have seen a decline in chicken, pig and cattle farming in the area, with the farms that still do mixed farming seeking to use their manures themselves, especially with the price of fossil fuel derived fertiliser where it is now. We have worked closely with our agronomists to maximize the availability and neutralize the salts in our digestate liquid through the use of humic and fulvic acids. This has been extremely beneficial, although an added cost, it is a natural chelator, plant and soil biostimulant, increasing the nitrogen efficiency, but also helpful as an oxygen promoter and biological stimulant. We apply the liquid both at cultivation and after emergence using our dribble bar applicator to minimize volatilization. We've also moved to a precision planter, which allows for liquid micronutrients application at planting and also eliminates overlap and reduces the use of inorganic phosphates. We also use solid digestate to enhance our soil structure, which is always a challenge on the downs. The fibrous matter helps aeration and also provides good organic medium for microbial growth and fits very well within the cover cropping regime that we use. Digestate is not just a standalone material, rather it has become an integral part of the farm's approach for nutrient application. Developing carbon management and biological regeneration, we have also found that slugs, snails and pigeons find it a deterrent. Lastly, we are working to optimize phosphate availability and take-up by the plants, reducing the chance of any soluble phosphate runoff. Humic materials added to the liquid AD have a very big CEC, cation exchange capacity. This has the capability of holding on to nutrients in a form that is available to the plant, rather than the unavailable form that the excess soil calcium forms when phosphorus is applied to the field. The last part of the journey has been to work with horticulturalists to develop our solid and liquid digestates into retail products for use in large market gardens and for domestic use. As we say, made from plants, for plants. We are learning all the time about how best to use the digestate, both on our farm and local gardeners. So how does this all fit with sustainability? Minimizing methane emissions, food security, and the health of our soils. Well, whilst we are primarily involved in energy crops, in a rotation, we are very focused on providing an outlet for break crops to improve food crop yields, providing a manure substitute for our neighbors, organic farmers, and our own farm, as well as improving the ability for all the land we touch to produce food more sustainably. We have measured good improvements in our own soils over the last 10 years. We have dramatically reduced the use of fossil fuel-derived fertilizers locally, as well as improving the availability of the nutrients in our digestate. In our view, AD is a very useful enabler for an ever-increasing arable-only farming cycle. Now, I want to ask you a question. People talk about being filthy rich. Can anybody tell me where that expression actually comes from? Because most people will think that actually it's because money's dirty, it's gone through many hands. If you've got more money than me, therefore you must have made it somehow in a dirty, horrible way, because we're all frightfully intelligent, and he's not as intelligent as me, and yet he's got more money than me, therefore it must be filthy. Any ideas? Well, let me take you back to a time when there was no inorganic fertilizer. Let me take you to a time when we were bartering because money didn't actually exist. And therefore, food was money, big money, because without food you didn't live. But how did you get more food than the next man? By having manure, lots of manure. And the more manure you had, the more food you could grow. But in those days, it was a dirty business, filthy business. Moving that manure around to actually grow food was difficult and trying. And therefore the expression filthy rich, because you had to be filthy to be rich. And today I have to say I've got 12,000 tons of manure sitting in my yard, but we won't go there.
That was interesting. Okay, so our last speaker has joined us already. I'm being given the thumbs up. And it's Hamish Jolly, as I introduced earlier. We cannot see him yet, but I'll start introducing him. Hamish holds a Bachelor in Business Law and Accounting degree. He is a former Director of Strategy and Ventures at Bank West and former CEO of Greening Australia, one of Australia's largest environmental NGOs. He's a co-founder of DeLorean Corporation and has played an integral role in advancing the bioenergy sector in Australia. Hamish would be speaking today on behalf of Joe Oliver, who is the Managing Director and also co-founder of DeLorean. Joe is listed on the program as I mentioned earlier, but has unfortunately have to come down with some very familiar illness that we all have lurking around. So thank you very much for stepping in, and we are all ears. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone, and really appreciate the opportunity to present. I think, given the time, I'll just contextualise this in what's been discussed before. But I guess the key issue, the key explanation for us is Delorean Corporation, for context, is a fully integrated. We've been around about 8 years in Australia. We've been pioneering bioenergy and particularly anaerobic digestion in Australia, and working against those barriers to entry for anaerobic digestion, which have been referred to earlier. Having built a plant about 8 years ago, the second only commercial industrial scale plant in Australia, we've been able to put together an engineering division, an infrastructure division, building out a pipeline of projects, and even an energy retail company. So we've got momentum now with anaerobic digestion in Australia, but it's been a long journey. And we've got a pipeline of projects. We listed on the Australian Stock Exchange last year. So we've been able to sort of galvanise, I think, after a lot of hard work, the very embryonic start of anaerobic digestion in this country. In a very broad context, it's clear that anaerobic digestion provides the solutions for organic waste. A third of the world's food is wasted. That's consistent with what's happening in Australia. We also have land and water wasted in production. And anaerobic digestion provides the solution by diversion of landfill here, and also the solution to some degree for biofertilising crops. What I would say in the Australian context is the economic model of energy crops here doesn't work. The subsidies in the downstream for anaerobic digestion don't exist. And so the industry relies on commercial industrial food waste streams for projects to get up, and on agricultural residue type models. The commercial food or the waste sector here in Australia is very much a spot market. It's hard to get bankable take or pay contracts in the Australian marketplace, so it's a difficult marketplace to penetrate. That said, there is a national policy in Australia to halve the amount of organic waste sent to landfill by 2030, which is interesting. Mark Sutton's comment about nitrogen earlier on. So that translates to about 12.5 million tonnes of organic waste, excluding the ag sector, around the country, and about 28 million tonnes if you include agriculture and fisheries. So there's no shortage of commercial, industrial, or organic waste, but I think people are starting to get that message. Similarly, there's some good soils here in Australia, but there's also, for example, in West Australia, where I'm speaking to you from, very sandy soils and a big requirement for fertiliser and broadacre agricultural farming. This graph, sets out the vicissitudes in the fertiliser price, exacerbated by what's going on in Russia and in Ukraine, and the opportunity to displace 1 tonne of mineral fertiliser with Digestate, which has got attendant savings in it. So a couple of quick case studies. This is the first plant we built about 8 years ago, 50,000 tonnes per annum, co-located with a composter, in this case, diverting commercial and industrial organics and providing power behind the meter for the composter and exporting to grid. And interestingly, I guess, the second project that we can point to more recently, which we're just commissioning, is co-located with a milling operation in South Australia. We think it's the first of its kind in the world, processing the ground out milled feed, which is the husk and dust that's coming from the mill operation, putting it through anaerobic digestion, repatriating electricity and heat to allow that mill operation to grow. It's on fringe of grid, and diverting the balance through to a composting operation. I guess importantly, the story even up to a couple of years ago here was all about electricity and heat. Electricity, particularly behind the meter, because that was where it was most economic. But with the rise in gas prices globally, and more recently the risk of pipelines having stranded operations and gas being diverted from new developments in Australia, there's the big story now is biomethane and its opportunity to displace coal and support the transition of gas in the Australian marketplace. So look, there's probably a bit more, but I think they're probably the key points, and given time, we'll leave room for Q&A later on. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you very much. That was very useful, and I think all the presentations link together quite nicely to actually provide that vision that we spoke about of AD not only being energy, also having to do with nitrogen. It's not only a technology that applies to Europe, it's a technology that can help worldwide, and is happening in agricultural, in food waste, etc. I don't know if the audience has any questions. I haven't seen any questions on the platform. Do you have any questions, anybody? Otherwise, I might ask a couple myself. No questions? Yes? Can you grab the microphone, please? And could you say your name and also who do you think you are asking the question to,
yes,
or the whole panel?
It's no, Tom Chilton, and I'm asking the question to the final speaker. There was a slide where he said using digestate instead of a chemical-based fertiliser could displace 1 tonne would displace a tonne of oil, I think 105 litres of water, and I think 6 tonnes of CO2 would be saved from being released from the atmosphere. Wondered where the figures came from. It's a really interesting statistic, and as you know, working for a company who's trying to sell our solid and liquid digestate to, well, neighbouring farms would be useful, but to any farmers who would take it, that would be a really useful figure to help in our sales, definitely, and to try and encourage people to take up what is a really useful byproduct, because there is resistance at the moment.
Hamish?
Yeah, thank you. That was in my presentation. In fact, I'll need to take it on notice because I was presenting for Joe, and Joe's compiled the presentation. So look, I'm very happy to provide that detail, but it's one I'll have to take on notice, unfortunately.
Thank you. We have another question here.
It's working, yeah. Jorge Hiller from Argentina. Question for Henry. Have you been monitoring the soil contents, and your soils are increasing through the deployment of digestate and cover crops that you're using?
Is Henry working?
Hi.
Henry's microphone?
Right, in answer to your question, the answer is yes. I mean, our indices were relatively poor, and now they have risen. What we have to make sure is that we stay within the statutory guidelines. And that's why we have, for instance, for maize planting, we're now using micronutrients and not using phosphates, so that we're not superloading phosphate upon phosphate in our fields. But yes, we analyse our fields annually so as to remain compliant with the law.
Any other questions? We have a question there at the back. They're making you walk, John.
Yes, thank you. It's Andrew here from SLR Consulting. Follows on quite nicely from the question, perhaps to Mark and Henry. Do you foresee risks in digestate spreading on fields, considering nutrient saturation and things like the nitrate vulnerable zones? Do you see those expanding, or is there a nice cycle, a circular cycle to that? And I think, Henry, interestingly, you mentioned perhaps using additives to fix phosphate into the digestate. That's of interest. So do you see risk in the future for those?
Who goes first? Do you want to go first?
Mark, do you want to go?
Mark, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. I'm happy to go first. I think the first thing is really not to see digestate as a waste product or a byproduct, but see it as really a co-product with value that you don't want to put in excess on the soil. That also means knowing exactly what's in your digestate. I've made the point that I'm quite in favour of reprocessing those back into the fertilizer chain. But of course, that's not always going to be possible. If it's not possible, that means making sure that the digestate you apply is either directly incorporated to avoid those ammonia emissions or acidified, and that you know exactly what nutrients is in that pack. And therefore, it should be part of the nutrient management plan of a farm. Just to make the point about the nitrates directive you've raised on that, I don't see them expanding in the UK. Obviously, in Europe, they're already there. Of course, the limitation there is on limitation of organic substances to soil. If you reprocess it back into the fertilizer chain, it's no longer part of the limitation of the nitrate directive. And of course, that would be another incentive for doing so.
Okay. And Henry, I think we've got still a couple of minutes, so if you want to...
I'll just carry on with that and essentially say that we are in an NVZ. So the law is very clear as to what we can and can't do. In fact, all the farms we supply are in an NVZ, and we operate within the legal guidelines on everything. And we test our fields, as I said earlier, every year. We know precisely what we're putting on, and we're getting clear benefit from this fantastic product.
Fantastic. And we've got another question there.
Hi, to Henry. What about the CO2? What do you do with the CO2 that you get from your operation? How are you handling that product today?
Well, that's a really, really interesting question. So when we put the CO2 plant in, we borrowed the money from a bank, from HSBC. So they wanted to know how we were going to sell it. So we therefore had to tie ourselves down to a contract with an off-taker who was going to be reliable. And in that case, we did a contract with Air Liquide. And that worked really well. They took it, and the market was stable. We were being paid a reasonable price at the time, and the price of electricity and so on was low. Now, we come to the last few months, or let us say back to last autumn, and the problems with CF fertiliser. And suddenly, the value of CO2 went through the roof. Air Liquide did not want to share that value, so they were taking it from us at £50 a tonne and selling it on for £400, £500, £600, £700 a tonne. And they were saying that they had to do it like that because they were blending it with the high price that they were having to pay for the CO2 that they were being forced to take from CF fertiliser. Now, who were being incentivized by the British government. Now, in Europe, the whole of this would have been totally and utterly illegal, what was going on there. The government subsidizing one company at the expense of any other CO2 producer. I mean, unimaginable, unbelievable. I took the Secretary of State to task on it, and he threw a hissy fit. He knew exactly where I was coming from, and he and the government were utterly incorrect in the way they went about dealing with this. Anyway, the net result is I've broken the contract legally with Air Liquide. I have put on order some tankers of my own. I've bought a second-hand one out of Germany, which will be up and running by the end of June. I've got my own contracts now, and I'm already delivering using contractors. And we're seeing an altogether better price, and I'm turning a business that was turning £375,000 a year into one that will make £2,500 a year, £2.5 million a year turnover. And I will never be held by people like that.
Well, what a way to finish. Fantastic. Thank you very much. That was quite a lesson learned for everybody, I suppose.
Well, the British government actually, and I'm sure you all know this, I happen to be a Conservative, but it doesn't really matter which party I support. I find this particular government unacceptable. It needs to go. They are absolutely incompetent at every level.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. You've got our contact details. If you want any questions or anything, please get in touch. Thank you.